Hey ghouls and gals, welcome back to my channel. My name is Taylor and today's video is another vlog in my series where I am reading through every single book recommended in Sadie Hartmann's 101 horror books to read before you're murdered. Today's vlog theme is the coming of age horror section, and I'm really excited for that section because coming of age horror is usually a subgenre of horror that I really enjoy, it by Stephen King being one of my favorite books of all time, so I am very optimistic about diving into this vlog. Mother Horror says about coming of age horror that nostalgia isn't just all sweet and good feelings. It's laced with the pain of an old wound. It's a happy memory infused with the knowledge that we can't ever go back there. A bruise that gets pressed, causing a dull ache. And that's why I love it. There's a sweet pain, a hurt that feels good when I read coming of age horror. Imagine kids on bikes enjoying the summer while saving the world from evil. That is quintessential coming of age horror. There were actually 9 books recommended in this section. However, because especially for this series where I am reading books that sometimes I have never heard of with authors that I have never heard of, I don't want to go out and purchase a bunch of new books because I'm on, I was on a strict no buy last year. This year I'm also a little bit on a no buy and just buying books from authors that I've read and loved before. So I'm not purchasing any new books for this vlog. At the very end of this series, I might go back and see if maybe my library has acquired some of the books or purchase some of the books for my own to do a second go around and finish up reading all of the books that were recommended. However, for this vlog, we are reading 4 books. The books that I could not find access to at the library were Knock Knock by S.P. Miskowski, Pen Pal by Dathan Auerbach, Of Foster Homes and Flies by Chad Lutz, and The Deer Kings by Wendy Wagner. So if you've read any of those and you absolutely love any of them, let me know down below and I'll try and prioritize them for a vlog later on in the future. But of the 9 books, I've actually already read one of the selections, and that's The Ghost Tree by Christina Henry. I thought this book was okay. I would recommend this for the end of summer, beginning of fall. It really gave me Stranger Things vibes, and a lot of Christina Henry's work on paper, it should be a 5-star read. There's just something about the execution that doesn't work for me a lot of the time for Christina Henry's work, but I thought this was okay. Clearly from how I'm describing it, it was a little bit forgettable, but it does have to deal with a ghost tree, a small town that mysterious things are happening that may or not be connected to this titular ghost tree in town. So I did think that one was okay. It was a very fast-paced, speedy read. I would recommend it. I can't remember if it's actually YA or not, but I think it's a really good book. If it's YA, it's a great book for YA readers, or if it's adult, it's a great book to branch from if you typically read YA into the adult genre. So I have read that book, but let's move on to the other books that I'm actually going to be reading for this vlog. So in this vlog, I will be reading The Bottoms by Joe Lansdale, December Park by Ronald Malfi, The Bone Weaver's Orchard by Sarah Reed, and The Listener by Robert McCammon. And we are going to kick off this vlog by reading The Bone Weaver's Orchard by Sarah Reed. Mother Horror says, get ready to fall in love with the main protagonist, Charlie Winslow. This young man is so sweet and eccentric with his passion for insects. He's brave and curious. He's left on the front steps of a dark, intimidating boarding school called the Old Cross School for Boys. Charlie gets settled and soon learns that something prowls the halls at the Old Cross and boys mysteriously go missing. The staff always say that the missing boys ran away. Of course, Charlie, being the curious young boy that he is, witnesses a shadowy figure in his dorm room one night. Strange things are happening, and Charlie is not one to focus on his studies nor ignore the potential to find out why boys keep disappearing. This is set in 1920s England. I really love historical horror, and also this takes place at a boarding school, which I do love a good dark academia, especially in the fantasy genre, so potentially that'll be the same for the horror genre as well. So I'm going to go get to reading this book. I will check back in at the 50% mark to let y'all know how I'm feeling. So right now I am 50% of the way through The Bone Weaver's Orchard by Sarah Reed, and I am enjoying my time with this one so far. I would say just based on the way that this story is going, the way that it reads, the main character being 13 years old, I do feel like it can fit very comfortably into YA horror. So I think if you read a lot of adult horror, you could still enjoy this, but I definitely think so far, at least at the 50% mark, this is a good introduction to maybe bridging the gap between never having read a horror and trying horror, or maybe just primarily reading YA and wanting a horror that's, to my knowledge, not necessarily recommended as a YA horror, but I think YA readers could still get a lot out of this one and enjoy it. So we're following our main character, Charlie. He goes to this boarding school and he's a little bit of an odd duck. He's a little bit of a misfit. He does not have like the same base level of knowledge and learning that the other boys do. He comes from a place not of privilege like the rest of his peers, and he also is very obsessed with bugs. He keeps a little insect collection in jars underneath his bed, and none of that endears him to his fellow students. However, at this school, Charlie not only has to deal with the bullying from other students, but also mysterious figures that walk the halls at night in this school, and a series of mysteries surrounding this school, including the fact that young boys often disappear from the premises, never to be seen again. So this one, I do like the school element. I really enjoy that aspect. I really like a good dark academia. This one is not as ambiance focused. This one is definitely, I feel like, more plot forward than character forward. We do get a lot of character work, but there's no like long paragraphs of lush descriptive prose like you might expect in a dark academia novel. So while this is set at a school, I wouldn't necessarily slot it into that category. Dark academia tends to be a little bit more gothic, a little bit more descriptive, and generally is a critique of a little bit different in terms of commentary than this book is doing. So I'm enjoying the fact that it's at a school. Charlie's a very endearing, likable main character. He's an underdog. We want to root for him. I'm having a good time with this one so far. I am reading the ebook on Libby. I think this one's about 200 pages for the physical book, so definitely it's a fast-moving story. The mystery is very intriguing, and I'm very curious to see how the next 50% of this one is going to go. I kind of feel like I've put together some of the pieces, but not in a way where I feel like this is predictable, and I could be wrong also. So I am interested to see what is happening with all of the mysteries, and that'll be the next 50%. So far, so good. This is a middle-of-the-road, enjoyable, fast-paced read for me. I'm gonna go finish up this book and I will check back in later and let y'all know my final thoughts. Okay, so I finished The Bone Weaver's Orchard by Sarah Reed, and overall this was a fast-paced, plot-driven horror novel that I think would really appeal to people who maybe like YA horror more, or definitely a more plot-forward rather than a character-forward story. This was very short. I liked the pacing of this because I think had this book been longer, I would not have enjoyed it as much. I think part of that has to deal with the fact that we do follow a younger protagonist, so some of the decisions that he makes, some of the conclusions he comes to, and some of the decisions and like people he trusts, you as an adult reader, as you're reading this, you understand a lot more than Charlie does. You're able to figure out the mysteries of what is happening like a lot earlier than he does, so it's a little frustrating to see him enter these situations where he really shouldn't. However, I think that's part of the horror, especially in the 50% mark, like the last 50%. I think a lot of the horror is not necessarily what is happening, because you start to figure that out before Charlie does, but you as the reader now know what's happening, and you have to watch Charlie figure it out on his own, and you can't do anything to stop him. You can't do anything to help him or pull him back from these scary situations. So that was a little bit frustrating for me, was that I had mentioned in the last update I kind of thought where this was going to go, and I felt like there were clues clues that were placed very deliberately so that you could figure it out. But because this book was so short, it's in the 200-page range, I was able to breeze through it pretty quickly, and the things that bothered me didn't bother me enough to DNF. So like I was thinking in the last update, this is very middle of the road. I would suggest it for people who like a more plot forward rather than character forward story. So I've completed the first book in this vlog, and we are moving on to the second book, which is The Bottoms by Joe Lansdale. The Bottoms takes place in East Texas just after the devastating effects of the Great Depression in the 1930s. Our story zeroes in on a family living by a river, an area known as The Bottoms. Lansdale paints small-town life with exquisite and intimate details. The townies are bright and colorful, but this isn't a feel-good story of good triumphing over evil all of the time. This town is saturated with racial tension, and to add fuel to the fire, there's someone out there murdering sex workers. Our sweet kiddos and protagonists Tom and Harry stumble upon one of the first bodies, so their dad Jacob takes up an investigation, a murder mystery that gets more and more intense as the story goes on. Also in the description for this one, Mother Horror says this is a very character-driven mystery, so hopefully this book will be a little bit more character-driven than the last one. That's what I tend to prefer in my stories. I'm really intrigued by this mystery aspect and the murder mystery, and I think this is going to be like a detective story plus coming-of-age horror, so looking forward to checking this one out. I'm going to go read some of this, and I will check back in at the 50% mark and let y'all know my thoughts. So I am now 50% of the way through The Bottoms, and I think I'm enjoying this story so far. There's a lot that I'm really enjoying. There's a lot that I'm not so wild about, but this is a story about Texas in the 1930s, and our main character Harry is a young boy who lives in the country with his parents and his little sister. When he and his little sister are exploring in The Bottoms, that's an area of woods around their house, they discover the body of a Black woman. Now this is important because it's the South. It's the 1930s, and Harry and his parents and the rest of the town are white. Harry's father is the barber and also the constable. This is a very, very small town, and Harry's father is determined to find this woman justice. However, with racial tensions in the town rising and more bodies piling up, Harry starts to learn things that he never had to think about as a younger child. This is a coming-of-age horror story and a murder mystery where Harry is realizing that racial prejudices exist, racism exists, and he's quickly learning the difference in justice and the justice system. Even though his father is well-intentioned and wants to find out who done it, there are a lot of obstacles, even from well-meaning and well-intentioned white people in the town, that are preventing justice from being found. So this book, in a lot of ways, feels like the horror equivalent of To Kill a Mockingbird. Maybe you could have gotten that with just the synopsis, but Harry's father very much feels like an Atticus type of character, and I will say, this is written by a white man. The audiobook is narrated by a Black man, and that was an amazing choice. I'm actually listening to the audiobook more than I'm reading it physically, and I prefer that. I've actually heard this audiobook narrator, and let me find out who it is actually, because I definitely recognize his voice and I enjoy him as a narrator. So Brad Sanders is who narrates this audiobook, and he does a great job. And also the amount of times that the N-word is used in this book, because it's in the South. It's in the 1940s, like late 30s, early 40s, and we're following and talking to a bunch of racist people. So that word is used. I'm not saying it's not period accurate, but I think it was a good choice to have a Black narrator narrate this audiobook. I think he does a really good job of potentially also breathing life into some characters that maybe if you were just reading them, and I did try to just read the first couple of chapters physically as opposed to audio, some of them kind of feel a little bit caricature-y, and the way in which Sanders does his audiobook narration, I think he adds a little bit of nuance and makes them feel more real. in particular the Black characters. So I think the audiobook is the way to go for this one, and I am intrigued. I do like a small town, and this is a very rural town, and it's so interesting because sometimes when you're reading this, you're like, this feels more like an 1800s sort of scenario, and then you realize that when we think of the 1920s, for example, like flappers and all of that, that's not what's happening around the country. And in rural places and in more poor places, like places still did not have electricity. In a lot of places it still felt just like, it doesn't feel like it's the 1930s, or what we've led to kind of assume that the late 1930s were like. So I do like those historical small town aspects. This is very heavy-handed in the commentary, and the commentary is interesting with the way in which this story is told. I almost feel like Harry is not the best main character to follow because his father is trying to shield him from some of these horrors. He doesn't want him investigating and finding more dead bodies and just having experiences with the clan and things like that. And Harry has a lot of instances. There are a lot of instances in this book where he is eavesdropping and he finds out information that he's not supposed to know, and at some point it all feels a little bit convenient. So I almost kind of want to follow his father. I feel like that might have been a more interesting narrative, but the coming of age aspects I think are going to be further explored in the latter 50% of this book, because Harry and his sister Tom, short for Thomasina, they believe that there's a goat man who lives in the bottoms, and they believe that the goat man is responsible for killing all of these women, and they want to do some investigating of their own. They've just mentioned that they haven't done that at the first 50%, but they want to do it in the last 50%. So I anticipate potentially, I don't know if this goes supernatural or not, but I think they're going to investigate in the bottoms in the second 50% of this book, and there's probably going to be more of a reason why we are following Harry. So far I'm cautiously optimistic about this one. A lot of things to like, a lot of things I don't love, but a lot of things that I don't love, I can't say they weren't accurate to the time in which, like the way that especially white men talked about Black people and women. So, you know, I'm cautiously holding my judgment back for now. And it's not that those can't be in a book, it's just like the way in which they are written. So I am going to go finish the last 50% of this book. This is definitely a faster paced read, at least for me. So I'm gonna go finish this one up, and I will let y'all know my final thoughts. Okay, so I finished the bottoms and I feel really let down by this one. I had some hope in the first 50%, and then the last 50% just really cemented that I didn't like this book. The things that I didn't like in the story became more prevalent, and the things that I liked became less so. So unfortunately, this is kind of a miss for me, which is kind of frustrating on a lot of ways, because particularly the introduction and the first chapter was setting this up for a story that I had the potential to really love, and it just wasn't that story for me. What I would have loved to see out of this one is more Harry and Tom together and exploring like on their own and kind of having their own story, like with the goat man and all of that, and exploring the bottoms. I enjoyed those aspects. I thought they should have been more prevalent throughout this book, because I thought that was such an interesting concept of the goat man. I liked those aspects. This one also, just all of the female characters, super cardboard, super two-dimensional, very sexualized as well, very uncomfortable to read from. This one, there were several instances in the story where our main character starts going off on like sexual tangents, and it feels really weird within the narrative. For example, there's a female character who dies. That's not a spoiler because this is following our main character's father trying to catch this serial killer, but there's a character who dies that our main main character knows, and he is like memorializing her and mourning for her loss, and he's thinking about how kind she is and how nice and the things that she has done for him and like their relationship together. And then he starts talking about how good she looked in a certain dress and how attractive she was, and going into detail about that, which was really weird. And there were just also certain places where things were super sexualized for I do not know what the reason was. There could have been commentary on the psyche of the killer, but it really seemed like our main character too had the same sort of Madonna horror complex that our bad guy had. So that was really up in the air. Some of the social commentary, most of it felt very ham-fisted. That I'm going to kind of give a pass on because this came out in 2000. So I was in first grade in 2000, or actually kindergarten in 2000. So I don't know what the national zeitgeist was like about race. So potentially this could have been a very like impactful book, and it could have been a very radical book at the time. In 2025, when I'm reading this, this feels very dated and very white saviory, and that brings me to my next point in that this feels like To Kill a Mockingbird if it was written as a Criminal Minds episode. Now, that is an intriguing setup, but it would be more intriguing if like it didn't kind of take a lot of the story beats from To Kill a Mockingbird. This felt like a retelling. This felt like a horror retelling, in particular with different character arcs and things that happened at the end. If you've read To Kill a Mockingbird, you kind of know what happens in here, and you know some of the big surprising twists that happen in the end of this book. So that's like a cool comp title, but unfortunately, like it doesn't do anything new with the material. So, you know, while the horror To Kill a Mockingbird sounds like a cool concept, I just would read To Kill a Mockingbird instead. I think, you know, that one does also have its critiques, particularly about white saviorism in the text, but you know, I do think it does it better than this book did. And that's what's so frustrating about this book, because I feel like in different hands this could have been a story that I really loved. Trigger warnings for this one. This is a very dark book. There is an on-page lynching of a character, so know that going in. It's very horrific. It's very unsettling. It's one of the like most heart-wrenching and unsettling and just horrific things I've ever read in a book. So know that going into this one, you are going to read that. In addition to that, there's a lot of gruesome, graphic murders. Every single main character, well, I can't even call them main characters, but every single female character pretty much in this that has a name and has dialogue does get sexually assaulted at some point in this story in some way, which I don't love. If you're going to pick this up, I would highly recommend the audiobook. It has a black narrator, and I really do stand behind what I said in the last update, because I did go back and forth listening to the audiobook and reading the physical, and I felt like the audiobook narrator really made some of these characters come to life and made them feel less stereotyped with the portrayal of the characters. So unfortunately, this one was a miss for me. We're now moving on to the next book, which is going to be The Listener. Mother Horror says The Listener is a great gateway into Robert McCammon's work, a genre mashup of supernatural suspense, historical fiction, crime drama, and coming of age. Set in 1934, this story is told in parts. We're introduced to immoral, unscrupulous adults John Parr and Ginger LaFrance, who swindle folks to make their way during the Great Depression. We also follow main protagonist Curtis Mayhew, a young black man who lives with his mother and works at a train yard, helping weary travelers and makes an honest living. We also meet Neela, a girl about the same age as Curtis, but born into privilege. Soon it's revealed that Curtis and Neela are unique, and it's their shared characteristic that will bring them together. So this one is another book that's kind of set in the Great Depression era. The last book was set right on the tail end of the Depression. This one's set right in the thick of it. Very intrigued. I've heard a lot of great things about this author, but I've never read anything from him. So fingers crossed that I enjoy this one. I'm going to go dive in. I'll check back in at the 50% mark and let y'all know my thoughts. So I am now 50% of the way through the listener, and I'm going to be honest, I am struggling with this one so far. I don't know if it's just like the wrong place, wrong time for me to be reading this book, if I'm like not in the mood for historical horror, or if it's just the book is not grabbing me. But this one is, it's fine so far. I don't see myself, like, I'm not itching to pick it up when I put it back down, and it is like very slow paced, which normally would not mind. I'm a huge character-driven reader, but it's slow in a way where I feel like we should know more about the characters, or like the plot should be progressed more, or we should know a lot more about the characters. But right now, at the 50% mark, the things that happen in the synopsis of this book, on the dust jacket, and every single like review that I've seen of this one, the plot is just getting started and being put together at the 50% mark, and the characters feel very, very one-dimensional so far. So I don't know if I'm going to love this one by the end or not, but the premise is intriguing. So we are following two con people, I suppose, con man, con woman, and they're both running separate cons throughout the United States. They meet up and decide to team up and do this very, very elaborate con, and it's the biggest con yet. It'll get them paid a lot of money, but it is very, very high stakes, and so they're trying to piece that job together. It involves a kidnapping, and then we are also following a young boy who has the ability to listen. He's a listener, which means that he can hear inside other people's minds. He can hear what they're thinking, and other people who have this ability, he can also communicate with them. So he is he hasn't done it yet, but I know in some way these three characters, they're all going to coincide, because I think Curtis, who is the young man who has this listening ability, is going to be a bystander because of his ability to this con and try and prevent it from either happening or save the day. My camera battery actually just died, so I don't remember what I was saying because I had to quickly charge it up to finish out this clip. But historical horror, it's something that I normally love. I will say, first chapter of this starts out pretty dark. One of the con people that we're following, it starts out in his perspective, and he does kill a bunch of dogs, a dog and her puppies, pretty gruesomely. So normally I will like spoiler tag that. I try and update people if a dog is mentioned in a book, dies or not. This is in the first chapter. It doesn't really have anything to do with the plot. I think it's just establishing that this guy is a horrible person, but it was a really rough scene to read. It was pretty detailed, so just a heads up going into this one that I think if you are going to pick it up, that's a good thing to know, because so far 50% of the way in, I was expecting the main protagonist to be Curtis, just based off of the plot synopses that I had read about this one. But it does seem like we are following Pearlie and Ginger, the two con people, more, so I think maybe it'll even out more in the second 50% of this book. But they are quite vile, and being in their headspace can get a little rough with the way that they view the world and the things that they end up doing. So just a heads up for that. There hasn't been any other like big on-page animal cruelty other than that first chapter, but it was really jarring. It was like a, oh, hello, we are picking up a very brutally dark horror story. So yeah, that's, I don't know where the next 50% of this is going to go, and the pacing really has me quite curious, because again, with such a slow moving story, with how slowly the plot is going, I would have expected more character work. I'm really crossing my fingers for this one that the character work improves in the second 50% and the characters start feeling more like characters and less like caricatures of different people. So fingers crossed that the second half goes better. I honestly don't think I probably should have read this and The Bottoms back to back, because it's two books where I believe both authors are white, and the way that they write about Black protagonists and Black characters is not great. It's not great. This one's doing it better than the bottoms, but that's not a very high bar to clear because the bottoms did not do a very great job of that, in my opinion. And this one is a little bit better, but there are still some pretty glaring stereotypes, and especially with all of the characters just feeling so one note and one dimensional, that leads into some pretty uncomfortable stereotypes of especially the Black characters that our white author is writing about. So I'm cautious about this one. I wanted to make that note as well, but even though this is an almost 400-page book, it is a fast-paced read. So I should be able to finish this one up soon, and then I will check back in and let y'all know my final thoughts. Okay, so I finished The Listener by Robert McCammon, and first of all, I wanted to clarify one quick thing that I know that I said in the last update. For this book, I kept saying that it was almost 400 pages. I was reading the ebook copy. The physical copy is only 336 pages. So when I was saying it feels very fast and readable for an almost 400-page book, that's because it's not almost 400 pages, but I still maintain that it is very fast and very readable, and that's one of the strengths of this book. I really did not love the way that this one ended for a number of spoiler reasons. Obviously, I'm not going to sit down here and tell you right out how it ended. However, this also has an epilogue that's my least favorite kind of epilogue. It's an epilogue where we go through all of the major characters and describe what they do with the rest of their lives. So from the end of the book to the end of their lives, pretty much. I really don't like that. I, for one, I don't mind an ambiguous ending. A lot of my favorite books actually tends to have more of an ambiguous ending, but even if the ending's not ambiguous and you have an epilogue, I don't mind an epilogue that does wrap some things up, but wraps up the story that happened, and it should be only a scene or two. It shouldn't be this long drawn out thing where it explains where, you know, all the kids grew up and what they did and who they married. I don't care about that. I care about the completion of the action of the story, and that's my personal thing. I don't love epilogues that do that, but that's kind of the ending I didn't really like. Overall, this one was written well. There was one thing though that I kept noticing that kind of bothered me, was that this is third person. It's not third person omniscient, it's third person and we're following a character and their thoughts and their internal dialogue, but we'll have perspective shifts from paragraph to paragraph. So that was very jarring, and I don't like that. If we're going to do that, I think either at least separate by doing a row of asterisks or something like that, signifying in some way that we're switching, because in the middle of a scene it would jump from one character to another, and that just felt very jarring to me, so I don't like that either. But the writing on a technical sense was good. So, you know, I don't know, I was reading through a lot of reviews for this one. This one is rated so high, by the way. I think it has a 4-point-something rating on Storygraph, so I am in the minority when it comes to not really loving this book. But I noticed a lot of the reviews that were on the lower end say that they'd read a lot of McCammon and this is not one of his better books. So I hear so much about Boy's Life. I might still pick up something from this author in the future, but I wasn't wowed by this one, and I think partially because number one, I think we followed Pearly for a large section of it, and I think we should have followed Ginger instead because she's the more compelling character, and there were especially some things at the end of this book that were introduced that made me want to follow her and know her story more. Pearly at the very beginning, the chapter 1 for this, even though I hate the animal cruelty, it really sets up the story in an interesting way and makes you think Pearly is some mastermind, but then as the story goes on, you realize he's not. He makes some very confusing choices, and you realize he's not really pulling the strings or a criminal mastermind. So I would have preferred to read from Ginger's perspective just to see what she was all about and get some background for her character, and also just with Curtis as a main character. I just think that he never had his own agency. I had a lot of issues with how he gets involved in the plot, because essentially he just drops everything in his life to save some white children, and just the tropes that play into that. He never had, like, I thought the listening ability was cool. There wasn't as much in it as I expected. The female characters in this one, again, felt very shunted to the side, and I could see a better novel coming out of this had we been focused more on Ginger, more on Nilla. So I don't know, this felt like a story where potentially the choices of point of view may have impacted how much I enjoyed the story, and I could see in a different alternate universe where the same story was written and we followed different characters that I would have liked this a little better, especially with the way just Curtis as a main character had so much potential but needed to be built up into his own character, his own three-dimensional character. And a lot of the issues that I'm talking about with characterization, I think if this would have been a novella, I think I would have enjoyed it a whole lot more, because it was very fast-paced, the action scenes were very fast-paced, and if we cut out a lot of scenes that I felt were added for, there's a scene in the end that happens to Curtis that does not like impact the plot a lot, and it just seems very gratuitous violence. It seems very torture porny, and if we cut down some of the scenes like that and like make this a really tight novella, I think I could have liked this one a whole lot more. But as it stands, I know I was saying it was like on par with the bottoms for me. I do like it more than the bottoms, and I don't know. Should I try out another book from this author? Let me know down below if you've read this, if you've read other books by this author. Is this like a fluke? Is this really not one of his best ones? Or should I just skip this author? He's not for me. Definitely let me know. But now we're moving on to the final book in this vlog. The last book in this vlog is December Park by Ronald Malfi. Mother Horror says the most enjoyable thing about Malfi's book, December Park, is that the story is very slow to unfold. While we're waiting for Malfi to reveal clues pointing to the killer and ultimately the killer's identity, we are altogether consumed with the lives of his protagonists, 5 very different boys around 15 years old who go to high school together. We spend the most time with Angelo Mazzoni. His dad is a police officer working on the case of the Piper and the disappearing kids. Angelo makes the case that while law enforcement must protect and serve, it's the children of Harding Farms that know the underbelly and all the secrets of the town, including the private lives of kids. This book is set in the 1990s, and Mother Horror says the best horror books are the ones where the reader falls in love with the characters because the risk becomes so high when our lovable characters are faced with danger. This book is no exception. So I have actually read a book by Ronald Malfi before and enjoyed it. That was Small Town Horror. So I am intrigued by this one. I kind of wish I would have read it a month ago. It's January right now, and you know, it's called December Park, so it would have been a cool December read, but I am very optimistic for this one. I hear great things about this title, this author. I've read from the author before and enjoyed what I read, so fingers crossed that we end out this vlog on a really great note. So it has been a little bit since my last reading update. You can probably tell by, first of all, the hair and then also my voice. I was a little bit sick for about a week there, and there's obviously still the remnants of it in my voice, but I did want to give just a final update for this vlog, and I do mean final update because while I was sick, I did manage to start and finish December Park by Ronald Malfi, and I really enjoyed this one. Honestly, I was a little bit nervous before reading this book to publish this vlog because there weren't any real standouts in this vlog so far. I thought some books were okay, and then others I really didn't mesh with, and I was just nervous because I hadn't found any like true recommendations out of this bunch to read and enjoy and then share with y'all as a standout horror book recommendation. and I have done it with December Park. I actually really enjoyed this one, so I'm glad that I'm ending this vlog off with such a success, and I'm glad I enjoyed this book in particular because I get the hype about Ronald Malfi now. Last year I read Small Town Horror from this author and it was okay, but I didn't understand. I didn't understand, and I know that sounds like pretty harsh, but I didn't understand why he's such a heavy hitter just based off that book. I thought it was okay. I think I even mentioned in the vlog where I read it that I would be interested in checking out more by the author because I enjoyed the writing style. I just didn't enjoy the story or our main character that much. So I did find both of those aspects that I was missing in Small Town Horror in this book, December Park. Now this one also is a small town horror book as well. Small Town Horror was the title of the other one, by the way. But this takes place in the 90s in a small town in Maryland, and we are following Angelo and his friends. They're about 15, 16 years old, right on the cusp of kind of leaving childhood. Obviously, if you've ever been those ages, you know it's a very transitional time, especially during the summer where you kind of feel torn between, okay, you do not have such an easygoing summer time. As a younger child, you have more responsibilities like getting a summer job and all of that. You're not quite an adult. You don't have any of the perks that come with being an adult, like a sense of autonomy and responsibility for your own self. You still feel very constricted by adults and by rules and being treated like a child, but you don't have the leeway of an actual child. So it's a very transitional time, and Angelo and his friends are experiencing this. This is a very thick book. It takes place throughout the span of about a year, and I did read this one as an ebook. My ebook copy was 611 pages. I believe the physical book is 500 or so, so this is very chunky. This is slow moving. This is definitely for someone who wants more of a character-driven experience because there's a lot of build-up before we get to the horror, because we're really building up Angelo and his friends and the relationships that they have with each other, and I think that's such an interesting backup for this story. This is truly a story where it makes the most sense to be a coming-of-age story. The things that are happening, it just makes sense to have them be juxtaposed with just a normal child's coming of age. So we're following, like I said, Angelo, his friends. They live in a small town, and there has been a series of disappearances of children. No one knows if they're related or not, but at the very beginning of this story, we find that a body has been discovered by the local police force, and actually Angelo and his friends stumble upon seeing the police finding this body, and it's a very pivotal moment for Angelo because it's one of the very first things that he has directly experienced in his life that really shatters the illusion of innocence and how things can go horribly wrong. Now, Angelo has had his own share of loss in his life, but obviously losing someone and then stumbling upon a crime scene and seeing a body die very unnaturally, very different experience. So right off the bat, the boys realize that horrible things are happening in their town, and they have to wrestle with that because they live, like, in a lot of aspects, a very idyllic childhood. The things that they fight about and that they worry about, they argue about, like, they're really low stakes, which is great. We want all children, right, to not have to worry about huge horrifying things. You only have to worry about, you know, maybe bullies at school or what's cool, what's not cool, what to do after school and all of that. So we are following this group of boys throughout the year as it turns out that these disappearances are not just disappearances, they're all interconnected, and they are the work of a serial killer. And these boys, you know, they decide to kind of take things into their own hands. They want to do an investigation of their own, and so they're doing that throughout this year. It shows, it's a very interesting juxtaposition because we have these boys doing typical teen things, very childlike things in the summer and celebrating holidays, and then we also have them trying to figure out and trying to make sense of this great sense of loss in a small town when horrible things keep happening and it feels like everyone is really powerless to stop it. So I really enjoyed that. The fact that Angelo and his friends are trying to find this serial killer on their own, like the way that they approach it very much at first feels like just a game, and that's what it is to them at first because they are still children, and as they start investigating and putting together more pieces, they start to realize, of course, that, you know, this is a very serious situation, a life and death situation, and also a situation that has made them all grow up very suddenly and have to face the darkness that can lie even within a very quaint little small town. And I just had a really fun time with this one. I will say, like, the 70% to 90% mark, I was so frustrated at these characters. I was so frustrated as an adult. I'm reading it on the page, I'm reading what they're deciding, and I'm like, for the love of God, please call an adult. Angela's father is a detective, and these boys are figuring out these clues and investigating and getting into increasingly dangerous situations, and I was screaming at the page internally, go get an adult, call an adult, tell an adult. But that was just a little gripe. It didn't like take my enjoyment out of the story. It really just raised the stakes for me to really worry about these kids. There was just a sense of fear and dread. I was really worried for Angelo and his group of friends. So there's about 5 kids that we're following, and it's very nerve-wracking. They're in a very dangerous situation, and because, you know, they are still kids, they don't fully grasp what they've gotten into. And as an adult, that's just, it's so scary to realize that while these kids are just out across town biking around, they're getting really enmeshed with a serial killer, and that's very terrifying. So the horror was very effective here, and this is one of those classic examples of coming of age stories where if you like the genre of stories, of horror stories about a group of kids on their bikes traveling around a small town in the summer, this one takes place during the entire year, but there's definitely a large part taking place in the summer, then I think this is a great example of that. It's very clear that the author grew up in the 90s, and a lot of this feels like he pulled, hopefully not the serial killer parts, but, you know, certain aspects of his own childhood and his own childhood dynamics into this story. It did feel very real. Like a great coming of age story, it's horrific. It's also sad and nostalgic and bittersweet and all of those emotions wrapped into one. So I had a really great time with this one, and I cannot wait to check out more from this author in the future. So that is going to be the end of this coming of age vlog. You know, this one had some highs and lows. I would say my least favorite book that I read for this vlog obviously had to be The Bottoms. I didn't love the ending, the character choices, and the narration. The audiobook narration really saved this one for me. I thought the characterization of anyone who wasn't a white man in this book was really weak, and I think ultimately it really towed the line between like an homage versus just repeating To Kill a Mockingbird. So I would recommend To Kill a Mockingbird because these stories, especially at the end, are very similar, and I think To Kill a Mockingbird is a classic for a reason, and it's written better than this one. So this is my least favorite. And then we have The Listener. The Listener is one where I feel like this would have been better suited as a short story. This probably would have been higher on the list if it was a short story. Had some qualms again with characterization and the writing style, and this one, I don't know. I know this is a heavy hitter in the horror genre. People love Boy's Life. I wouldn't automatically say no to giving this author another chance, but it's not one where like I want to prioritize doing so. So this one, I could see the potential. There were just things about the story that bothered me, in particular the characterization and the pace of this one. The next is The Bone Weaver's Orchard, and this one, you know, I still don't know like how much I would recommend it because coming of age horror is just such an incredibly stacked subgenre in my opinion, and this one is enjoyable, but it doesn't do like a whole lot. It doesn't reinvent the wheel, and overall this one was so middle of the road that I just feel like this one would be okay. I would recommend it maybe for a readathon or a shorter reading challenge where it might fulfill certain prompts, because I enjoyed my time with this one, but it wasn't like so memorable or packed a significant emotional punch like I normally expect, especially coming of age horror to do. I will note this is a debut and it very much reads like YA horror, and YA is not my preferred age range to read for horror, and because this is a debut, I'm sure this author only gets better from, if I don't know if they've written anything else or not. I can kind of broadly recommend this one because it doesn't take like any big risks or narrative chances that would make it stand out from other books in this category, but I didn't hate hate anything about it. So it was a middle of the road read. And then of course, December Park was by far the best book that I read for this vlog. One last thing about this one, it does get compared a lot to Stephen King's It. Don't go into it with those expectations. You can see King's influence on Malfi's work, that's for sure. But this one is not supernatural in any way, and I feel like if you compare a book to it, I feel like you almost expect supernatural elements, or at least I do. So go into this one knowing that it is not supernatural horror. It's a very true to life horror. There's not any ghosts or otherworldly cosmic creatures like it. In fact, I think a really good comparison, if we want to compare this one to a Stephen King work, would be The Body if it got like its treatment. So if we drew out The Body, because The Body is obviously a very short story, this one is a very long book. So think more The Body than It, but this one was really great. Like I mentioned before, it had the horror, it had me really worried for the characters, in particular our main character, and I enjoyed the slow-paced character study with the horror, and this really packs some emotional weight as well. So by far, if you pick up any single book from this vlog, let it be December Park. But that is going to be it for this vlog. If you enjoyed it, please give it a thumbs up, leave a comment down below. I will be taking probably a month off from this particular vlog series, so the next 101 horror books vlog you can expect will be sometime in March, so just keep a lookout for that. I'm still having a lot of fun enjoying this series, just gotta wait for some library holds to get in. Subscribe to my channel though so you don't miss it or any of my other content. Stay safe, stay spooky, and I will see y'all in the next video. Bye!